Well, I'm Baroness Cox, or Caroline Cox. When I introduce myself, I always say I'm a nurse and a social scientist by intention. That's what I thought I was doing with my life. I'm a baroness by astonishment. I wasn't born a baroness. It's God's sense of humour and God's gift, because one becomes a baroness in Britain today by being appointed to the British House of Lords, which is like a Senate in other parliaments. And I wasn't into politics. I was actually the first baroness I ever met. Quite a shock. But it came to me that to be able to speak in one of the houses of the British Parliament is a wonderful place to be a voice for those who have no voice. And that's how I try to use my privilege of being in the British Parliament.
Your very first time when you heard about Armenia, a lot of people say, what is this? We don't know where the country is, we haven't even heard. So the first time that you heard about it and the first time that you actually visited it, what was it that called you?
My very first acquaintance with Armenia and Karabakh. Armenia, of course, I had heard about from the earthquake days, but Nagorno Karabakh I'd never heard of until I was in Moscow in May 1991 at a conference organised by the famous Yana Nabana in memory of what would have been Andrei Sakharov's 70th birthday. I helped organise that conference, and I was chairing a session, and one of the members of my panel was a very impressive man with a burning passion to speak, and he was Zori Balayan. And as he spoke, he said, while you people here in Moscow are talking about human rights, my people are suffering them. And that was the time when Azerbaijan had begun the ethnic cleansing of the Armenians from Karabakh or Artsakh. 12 villages had already suffered deportations, including Getashen and Martunashen and Berzo. And we reported that back to the full conference. And I was asked to lead a delegation down to Armenia to get the evidence of what was happening to the people in Nagorno-Karabakh at that time. Took down an international delegation, and we became deeply convinced, independent, none of us were Armenians, that Azerbaijan was the aggressor, not Armenia, and that the people of Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh particularly were suffering serious violations of human rights, attempted ethnic cleansing, indeed what could have been a rerun of genocide.
Especially after that, what was it that kept you coming the second time and the third time, and I know for 60-something times?
Well, my first visit to Armenia and Karabakh was on that occasion when we went down with Zori Balayan. I didn't go into Karabakh on that occasion, but we met the victims of the deportations. We saw the marks on their bodies where they'd been badly treated. We heard their heartbreak stories. And then the second time, I went to Azerbaijan, because if we're in human rights field, you always must hear both points of view. So I went to Azerbaijan, I met then President Mutalibov, but I absolutely insisted that they would take us to Karabakh, which, under a certain amount of pressure, they did. And that was when we first met the Armenians in Karabakh, who were suffering such horrendous treatment. And it became very clear that Azerbaijan was the aggressor. The Armenians were not the aggressors. They were fighting desperately for survival of the right to live in their own land. And that was the beginning. And then since then, I've just come back for my number 82 visit. There many times during the war, used to count 400 GRAD missiles a day on Stepanakert, and the low-flying aerial bombardment, and the courage of the people. And I always say thank you to the Armenians of Karabakh and Armenia, because you held a front line of faith and freedom for the rest of the world and for the rest of Christianity in that historic and very, very bitter and costly struggle. And since then, we now return to Armenia and Karabakh. Armenia, of course, needs a lot of help, but our focus is Karabakh because it's still unrecognised, and we go there with my small NGO, HART, Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust, to provide aid and advocacy, and the focus of our aid is an inspirational rehabilitation centre in the heart of Stepanakert, directed and established to international excellence by our wonderful partner Vada and Tadevosian.
To someone who has never heard about Nagorno-Karabakh, how would you briefly describe this conflict? What is it about?
I think the situation in Karabakh is a typical example of attempted ethnic cleansing. When we were there during the terrible days of the war, Azerbaijan used massive military offensives to try to drive all the Armenians out from Karabakh. The then President Elchi Bey once said the famous words of ethnic cleansing: if there is a single Armenian left in Karabakh by such and such a date, the people of Azerbaijan can hang me in the central square of Baku. That's a statement of ethnic cleansing. But what we saw was outrageous, what I would believe would be called war crimes or crimes against humanity, the use of cluster bombs against civilians, the use of GRAD, multiple missile rocket launcher, directly on civilian targets, massacres, the massacre at the village of Marahar, an attack on a village with civilians. And we saw that the day it happened, we saw the decapitated bodies, the burnt bodies, we saw the burning homes, we saw the evidence of that massacre. So it really was a question of attempted ethnic cleansing. In my own particular vocation in life, where I try to be a voice for the voiceless, we try to follow in the footsteps of Andrei Sakharov, who said he was always tried to be on the side of the victim. The Armenians at Karabakh certainly were the victims of that attempted ethnic cleansing, and I believe it was absolutely right to be there. Azerbaijan, of course, tries to stop people from going there. Even now, as a ceasefire, Azerbaijan does not want people to visit Karabakh. They always try to intimidate parliamentarians and tell them they're going to be on a blacklist if they visit Karabakh. Well, I'm quite proud to be on that blacklist. I'm in very good company with a lot of other very significant people who care passionately for justice, peace and human rights.
About the Western view, or about let's say this widespread view among the Western politicians, including the policy of Great Britain, because we're here now.
I'm always very deeply worried by British foreign policy with regard to the situation in Karabakh. Way back during the war, I remember I brought back photographs of children shredded by cluster bombs. I went to the then Minister of State responsible for that part of the world and asked him if the British government would make representations, the government of Azerbaijan, to stop dropping cluster bombs on children. It's right against all international conventions. The reply I got had full marks for being very brief. All the minister said to me was, no country has an interest in other countries, only interests. And we have oil interests in Azerbaijan. And he showed me the door. Well, I was furious. We had a debate in the House of Lords. I quoted those words. I said, for the first time in my life, I am ashamed to be British. I'm not naive. I can understand strategic interests. I can understand commercial interests. But I don't think it's the long-term interest of any nation to let those obliterate concern for human rights. And I don't think the majority of British people would want oil at the price of cluster bombs on children. I'm still concerned because everyone knows Karabakh is not recognised. I think Karabakh has every right, at least as much right as the people of Kosovo, to their self-determination. Azerbaijan was manifestly trying to carry out the ethnic cleansing and did it with brutality and violence and what I would say would be war crimes and crimes against humanity. The people of Karabakh deserve the right to determine their own future, whatever that may be. That's their call. But I think they should be party to the present discussions that are going on. It's their future that's being discussed. And I believe they have a right for self-determination. And the fact that Azerbaijan does not allow people to go there, the fact that the British embassy is not allowed to send an ambassador there, shows that there is a huge asymmetry. And Azeri propaganda, which is full of hostility and full of hatred, I think is shameful and does nothing to help the situation at all.
So what should be done that would serve justice, according to you?
There is a huge asymmetry, and I think a very unacceptable approach from Azerbaijan, which does not even go along the proposals from the Minsk group. So I think there should be pressure put on Azerbaijan to desist from its aggressive propaganda, its continuing threats of further military action, and its asymmetrical treatment of people. Just recently, there has been the infringement with the cross-border firing and the killings across the border. I understand they were initiated by Azerbaijan. There was also a very unbalanced way with the treatment of poor individuals who happened to cross the border unintentionally. The man who crossed from Armenia into Azerbaijan, as I understand it, was himself doing it in innocence, maybe had some slight problems intellectually himself. But he was paraded, as I understand it, by Azerbaijan as a commando, as a soldier. He was tortured and executed. Just when I was there fairly recently in Karabakh, we heard how a young man, or maybe just a teenager, had crossed by mistake from Azerbaijan in the so-called borderlands. And, of course, he was picked up. He was questioned. Then he was given to the Red Cross and sent back home unharmed. Now, I think that is very typical of much of what we saw during the war, with the brutality inflicted by Azerbaijan on prisoners of war and civilians whom they abducted. When we were there in Karabakh, we met Azeri prisoners of war. They were being very well looked after, as well by all international conventions. So I think the international community really should call Azerbaijan to account for its gross violations of human rights, for its continuing aggressive posture, its refusal to honour commitments or recommendations by the Minsk Group. And what it is doing is utterly counterproductive and is the opposite of confidence building. How they can expect anyone in Armenia and Karabakh to respond in any constructive way when all they do is carry on with this very aggressive propaganda is unreasonable. Azerbaijan propaganda is outrageous, and sometimes it's quite funny. I remember I came out from Karabakh 2 or 3 years ago, and I was told in the British embassy in Yerevan, who of course look at the Azeri newspapers, and there was this large article with a big heading saying, "Shoot the Cox." And underneath that it said, Cox only goes to visit Karabakh to look after her opium fields. Why else would she go, and how else can she raise the money for her humanitarian work? Well, I've asked my friends in Karabakh to look for those opium fields. I haven't found them yet. But over here in the UK, yes, I think it's European Azerbaijan Society obviously has a lot of money and produces a lot of very beautiful, very high quality in terms of the publication material, not high quality in terms of its content. I mean, it is flagrantly biased, partial, misleading, and often quite untruthful. I think in terms of Azeri propaganda, one of their most successful, at least for the time being, propaganda coups has been their representation of what happened at Hodrolu during the war. And I gather they have sort of Hodrolu commemoration days, they call it genocide, and that is outrageous. I mean, I was there around the time all that was happening. I mean, first of all, the Armenians did everything they could to get the civilians to leave Hodrolu before they had to take it. They had to take it because it was a base used for firing GRAD missiles onto Stepanakert, so it was survival. They did everything they could to encourage the Azeri civilians to leave. As I understand it, when they got there and they saw there were still Azeri civilians, they halted the advance. Then, when the retreat did take place, as I understand it, the Azeri civilians were intermixed with the soldiers, so some were killed, but nothing like what the Azeri propaganda said. I remember seeing headlines in British newspapers saying thousands of Azeris killed by Armenians. Outrageous exaggeration. And then I also understand that between the time when they had the bodies and then they were allowed to, also when the Armenians allowed them to come back and take, very sadly, the people who had been killed, that in the interval before the press conference, they actually mutilated some of those bodies. So it looked as if the Armenians had done the mutilation. Now, that is all deceitful. It is untrue. So as there, the reality was very different. I think one message I would like to give to the Armenian people is that it's really important to counter the Azeri propaganda and also to make the truth known about what happened to the Armenians in Karabakh. For example, I've already referred to the massacre at Marahar. That should really be much higher, I think, on the agenda for making, or say, winning the battle of the mind, winning the peace. The Armenians in Karabakh managed to win a military solution, but because of Azeri propaganda, so well funded, largely by oil money, and because I think of the Armenian reluctance to engage in propaganda, there have been some propaganda victories by Azerbaijan, and I hope that the Armenians will see there is equal need to fight the battle for the mind in order to win the battle for peace. Otherwise, propaganda will stick. It'll become a rewriting of history. And then when the Armenians want a sympathetic consideration of their case, it'll be distorted and diminished by Azeri propaganda, which can be refuted, and I believe must be refuted. I think the caviar diplomacy, I mean, it's well named, but it can work, and particularly when Azerbaijan does everything it can to stop people of influence and parliamentarians and so on visiting Karabakh to see for themselves. I mean, everyone who visits Karabakh sees for themselves, understands the reality. But if they only go on the caviar red carpet treatment, well, then they can get a very distorted view. So I would plead with the Armenians to make much more effort in the international arena to get the truth known about what happened in that war before it's too late and before the propaganda becomes the received history.
And you also know the roots of the war, according to you, how or why did it start and what were the foundations, the roots of it?
Well, as far as the beginning of the war was concerned, I was not there at that time, but of course there was the Karabakh movement. But one of the things, again, I wish sort of featured more prominently in the international discussions is the, again, asymmetry between what happened with Stalin's salami divide and rule tactics in Nakhichevan and Karabakh. I mean, I was actually in Nakhichevan when there were still Armenians in Nakhichevan, and Azerbaijan was driving them out with tanks and with shelling and destroying their villages. Now, of course, that is a fully Azeri-inhabited enclave or part of Azerbaijan, and is sort of recognised as part of Azerbaijan. Well, why can't Karabakh, which be given the same recognition? They were two parts of territory which Stalin deliberately used for political purposes, put Nakhichevan where he did, in the context of Armenia proper. Well, that's now been accepted as Azerbaijan. And it was with a ruthless driving out of many of the Armenians in the population, and as we know since then, of course, the barbaric destruction of some of the most famous historic churches and hatch cars in a really barbaric way in Nakhichevan. I think there should be far more sympathy given, as I've said before, to the rights of the Armenians to live in Karabakh and for the right to self-determination, because they really did have to fight against attempted serious, systematic ethnic cleansing.
As you know, the recent case of Safarov, this anti-Armenianism combined with the military, with the development of the military budget, actually poses an existential threat to Nagorno Karabakh. I'm not speaking about Armenia. So if nothing is done by the world, by the civilized world, by West, however we call it, what can be the consequences of the situation we are in here now?
Well, I think the present situation is one of great concern. As I understand it, Aliyev has been talking actually not only about regaining the land of Karabakh, but actually taking Armenia as well, which is outrageous as an internationally recognised sovereign state.
And historical distortions also good.
And the interpretations often put forward by Azerbaijan of where the land is and who lived there, and also their denial that any churches, any Christians lived in Karabakh, it's grotesque, but it's also dangerous. We know that if they were to occupy Karabakh, as they're trying to do in Nakhichevan, they would probably destroy every remnant of every Christian church that's been there. They destroyed many when they did occupy it. So it is a very serious situation. The enormous escalation by Azerbaijan of its military arsenal, largely using its huge oil revenues, again poses a very real threat to stability for Armenia, for Karabakh, but also to the whole region. So I just hope the international community will prevail upon Azerbaijan to desist from this continuing very aggressive, belligerent, not only propaganda, but possibly even intentions. And my hope would be that the international community must see that it's not in anyone's interest to have a huge regional conflagration. I mean, Armenians have proved that they can defend that little land against impossible odds. And anyone who goes to Karabakh, who goes to the Museum for Fallen Soldiers, will see in the early days of that war, when I was there, the Armenians managed to hold that little land with just hunting rifles against tanks. And they would fight with exactly the same determination again. Coming out this last visit just a few weeks ago through Armenia. I went to the wonderful cable railway to Tatev. And
What was it, sorry?
the cable, your wonderful wings, the cable,
Yes.
wonderful airway to the monastery at Tatev. And when I was there, some person I'd never met personally recognized me and came up and was very gracious and said, "Thank you so much for all you've done for my people." And I said, "Well, thank you. Who are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm actually at the moment serving in the Russian army. Not that I want to be a soldier, but because I have to learn how to fight in case we have to defend Armenia." And as soon as I heard that there were the troubles on the borders with Azerbaijan aggression, I came back immediately. And not just me, I can tell you, he said to me, that people will come from all over the world to defend Armenia if Azerbaijan begins its aggression again. He said, "I went to join the army to learn to become a soldier in case I have to fight, and I'm not the only one." So I think Azerbaijan must realize that if they wish to expand their aggressive policies, they will meet a very fierce resistance, and it would not be in their interests to actually allow a big regional conflict to erupt. And I think and hope the neighbours in the area will also not want a regional conflict to erupt and would therefore encourage Azerbaijan not to pursue its aggressive policies. Well, one of my hopes is, and I don't move in the world of the big oil magnates, but one of my hopes is that the huge investment by BP and others in Azerbaijan in its oil resources will also encourage those big oil pressure groups to persuade Azerbaijan not to go ahead, because it can't be in their interests to see all their huge investment, their interests in the oil, get caught up in a conflagration which might actually also set light to their oil interests. So I hope there'll be sufficient pressures on Azerbaijan, political and economic, not to pursue a military solution to what it still seems as a problem. My one worry is that, of course, everyone now knows the situation in Azerbaijan internally is deteriorating, particularly with regard to human rights. There are numerous reports coming out now of gross human rights violations in Azerbaijan. The freedom of the press is being brutally suppressed, religious freedom brutally suppressed. And one thing we know from history, of course, is that if a nation is facing internal conflict, then it will sometimes try to project that onto an external enemy in order to take the attention away from its own internal problems. So I think that is a possible danger. And again, I think it's every reason to call Azerbaijan to account for its own gross violations of human rights at the moment in its own country, and maybe to put some truth into the so-called the caviar diplomacy. Those who engage in that might also be a little bit advised about the reality of the country which they seem to be supporting on the basis of caviar diplomacy.
As a person who has visited Armenia, what can you tell to other people? Why is Armenia at all important? If we leave alone the politics, what is so special about it?
Well, over the many years I visited Armenia and Karabakh, I have developed an enormous respect, admiration, appreciation, affection for Armenian people. Not just because you're wonderfully hospitable, gracious, generous people, and all those. I remember even in the war in Karabakh, when the rations were down to 35 grams of flour a day and a quarter kilo of sugar a month, people always gave us food. We never knew the sacrifice behind the food that was put in front of us. But not just because of the characteristics of the Armenian people, which I think everyone who visits there appreciates very quickly. But I think Armenia is a very significant land, historically, culturally, so much to give to the world, with a wonderful tradition of, well, of course, for those of us who are Christians, the first nation to become Christian, some of the oldest churches in the world, and a church that's rebuilding amazingly after all those years of Soviet communism. But apart from the Christian side, the culture, the tradition, but above all, freedom. Freedom is indivisible. And if one person is denied the freedom, then all of us have denied our freedom. John Donne, the famous English poet, put it very well, that one man's death diminishes me, one person's loss of freedom diminishes my freedom. And I believe that all of us who had the privilege of living in freedom have an obligation to try to work to promote and to protect the freedom of others who are denied their freedom or whose freedom is threatened. There's a moral obligation there. But there's also a very personal appreciation. And I always say about Armenians, you do survive, you've survived so much. Genocide, earthquake in living memory, the attempted ethnic cleansing in Karabakh, you've survived all those. But as I always say, Armenians don't only survive, you create beauty from the ashes of destruction. And anyone who goes to Yerevan now remembers Yerevan in the dark days when there was 1 hour of electricity a day, and it was a grim, dark, difficult situation, and I had such admiration, particularly for the elderly people who had to climb up those tall apartment blocks with no electricity and carry water. Did so uncomplainingly. Karabakh, of course, suffered the horrendous war. But Yerevan now is a beautiful city. I love their dancing fountains at night. Karabakh is rebuilding amazingly. I mean, beautiful. Whenever you go there, there are beautiful buildings. Stepanakert is now a beautiful city. There are 2 new beautiful museums in Shushi. A lot of still war damage around, but a superb new art museum, a superb geology museum. The music conservatory is the school. Armenia is and Karabakh are centres of culture who give so much to the world. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to the Armenian people and the people of Artsakh, who held, as I say, that front line of faith and freedom, and to create beauty from the ashes of a deadly war.
The organization HART is actually doing a lot of support in Nagorno Karabakh and Stepanakert, helping the vulnerable ones. But we know that because Nagorno Karabakh is not recognized, international organizations such as UN and others, they do not actually have any representations there. So by doing the work in the field today, how do you feel about this?
Well, I founded and helped to run a small NGO, charitable NGO called HART, Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust. And I established HART to work for people who are suffering from persecution and oppression, who are off the radar screen of major aid organizations and the media. Because the big aid organizations, whose names we all know, like the UN and so on, can only go places with the permission of a sovereign government. If a sovereign government doesn't give it, they don't go. And therefore the people are left unreached, unhelped, unheard. So HART was particularly founded to work in those situations. And because people in those situations, trapped behind closed borders, they need often conflict or post-conflict, they need aid and they also need advocacy. They need a voice. So Karabakh comes right within our remit. And we also work in other parts of the world. We work in some of the areas in Burma still suffering at the hands of brutal regime. We work in Sudan, where there's another genocide going on in the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile. We work in northern Nigeria. So these are the places which HART was established to serve. But I will just say one thing that makes me angry with the UN, is that the UN does work in other disputed territories. And for some reason, UNHCR should have played, and UNICEF should have played very key roles for the people of Karabakh, particularly in the immediate post-conflict situation. I mean, the needs were tremendous for children, for refugees, for displaced people. And the fact the UN did not go there, I think, is something to be seriously challenged. I've written to them, I've asked them why they're not there. They're in other disputed territories, they're not in Karabakh. Well, they're not, and they'll have to speak for themselves as to why they're not. But we are there, and it is our privilege to support in particular the phenomenally inspirational rehabilitation centre in Stepanakert, which was established. We always ask local people their priorities. When we moved from emergency aid in war to ceasefire, we said, what is your priority? And the Karabakh authorities said, well, in the former Soviet Union, there's very little provision for people with disabilities. And it's true, I've worked in other parts of the former Soviet Union. With a disability, you're often stigmatized, you're often kept at home, it's a taboo, and you have a very poor quality of life. Well, Vardan, our wonderful director, broke all that down. He turned out a bombed-out building into an amazing centre of excellence. There's art, there's music, there is sport. Even people take part in the Armenian Paralympics. And of course, there's all the traditional therapies of occupational physiotherapy, speech therapy, there's hydrotherapy, a beautiful pool. But what's exciting is that not only gives hope and healing and a quality of life for the Armenians of Karabakh, but also spreads beyond that, and people come from other countries in the South Caucasus, from Georgia, from Abkhazia, Chechnya, even came from Chechnya, till they were recalled under threat from Azerbaijan to the Chechen government. But that concept of what you can do to give people with disability a quality of life is reaching through Karabakh and far beyond. And that's one of the things I often see in my mind, an image of Karabakh, like that little image in the Bible about a light on a mountain in a very dark part of the world. Karabakh shines like a light on the mountains of Karabakh, taking hope and healing far beyond its little land in a very dark part of our world today.
Well, thank you very much for all of your work and for everything. There's so many things, it's hard to enumerate, but for each of those, thank you. And thank you for the interview.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the chance to share a little of the pain and the passion and the privilege of being with your people. Shnura Garaju.